Namaste, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of the Kashmir conference. Just wanted to welcome all the viewers today. Today's day is going to be another very interesting day with various discussions on the topic. So yesterday we had discussions about what the trauma and the first-hand experiences of Kashmiri Pandits were during the times of the 80s and 90s, what they went through, what they experienced, and what can be done by Hindus as well as others who want to help Kashmiris reclaim their rights to their heritage and culture, as well as provide a opportunity for reconciliation. So today's panel is going to be talking about why the Article 370, what are the historic dynamics of Article 370, why it existed, and what has happened since the nullification of Article 370. What are some of the dynamics around it? Why it was important for the Article 370 to be nullified, and what are the opportunities that we see going forward? After that, we're going to have a panel of Kashmiri Hindu youth who are going to be speaking on their experiences as they share the stories of what happened to their ancestors and how the dominant narrative does not allow them to speak out as they would for any other group that has been subjected to genocide and ethnic cleansing. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Richa Gautam ji, Sanjay Dixit ji, and Sunanda Vashish ji. Richa ji is our coordinator for Kona in Colorado. She's a chapter president of the Colorado chapter, and she's going to be moderating today's panel.
Thank you, Nikunji. Swagatam and welcome to our session today. And I'm really delighted to have our guests, Sunanda Vashish and Sanjay Dixit ji. I want to introduction, though, my panelists are well known to everybody. Sunanda Vashish is author, writer, columnist. She's also founder of a publication called Mind Makers. And I think Sunanda ji has been embedded in our hearts and minds as, that viral video that went, around, and we saw her standing as the lone voice for the Indian Americans and for the Kashmiri Pandits, talking about the Kashmiri Pandit genocide and the exodus at the U.S. congressional hearings. So we really thank her from the bottom of our hearts for being that voice. And as someone who's a Kashmiri Pandit and who's herself seen the historicity of Jammu, Kashmir, and the saga and the genocide and the exodus from the valley, I think she is a great asset to this panel, and we really look forward to listening to her, as well as the fact that she's been keyed to the ground and to the realities of what's going on right now after the nullification of the 370 article. And Sanjay Dixit ji, I'm a big fan of yours as well. I have been following your Jaipur dialogues, and Sanjay Dixit ji is an IAS officer of the 1986 batch. And he's also a legal and constitutional expert, so he's going to throw some light on the constitutionality of these events that have happened last year. And, on anybody who's keyed in and seen Jaipur Dialogues has obviously seen some of his riveting conversations centered around current events. And also, I want to point out that Sanjay ji has recently written a book on nullifying 370 and enacting the CAA. So that's I think some of that element should, I will try to bring that out and ask Sanjay ji to go over that as we talk. So diving right into our conversation, I think I want to have Sanjay ji give us his opening remarks. And, we want to delve into, just for the sake of all our viewers, go back in time in history as to how 370 came to be part of our constitution, Article 370, as well as I know there's a history and there's a mystery to the 35A and how that came about. So I think this is a pretty interesting topic for people who do not have a background in the Indian American youth and the community. And I would like Sanjay ji to take it away and talk to us about some of that historicity up to the point when it was nullified.
Well, it's a very long ask, actually. And how much time do I have?
And you have just 10 minutes. Your time
Yes,
starts now. Well,
because
just the
in my
highlight of it, maybe.
book, in my book, I start the history in the 8th and 9th century. So obviously, in 10 minutes, I can't go that far. But I did that in order to trace the 7 exoduses and to prove the point that what happened in 1989-90 or throughout the 90s, and in some ways is happening even today, is not something which is an isolated event, but is just part of a narrative, part of a doctrine that started with Shah Hamadan and Sikandar Butchikan, the first Exodus, the Code of Umar, all that. But I think for today, I leave it at that. Now, let's dive right into the 20th century and how it happened and all the events that unfolded prior to the partition. Prior to the partition, once the Mountbatten plan got unfolded, it became clear to everyone that contiguity principle was very important, and the way the Indian Independence Act 1947 was crafted and the schedule appended to it, I think there was every possibility of the Gurdaspur district of Punjab going to Pakistan. And if that happened, then there would not be any kind of a continuity through the plains with India and Jammu and Kashmir. So even in the beginning, even though Sardar Patel managed to integrate all the 560 plus princely states except 5. These 5 were Bhopal, Junagadh, Travancore, Hyderabad, and Kashmir. But he appears to have expended the least amount of time on Jammu and Kashmir. Because Jammu and Kashmir, even according to Patel, he thought that if the contiguity principle was applied, then India would hardly have any kind of proper contiguity with Jammu and Kashmir. After all the logistics, all the supplies, all the roads, all the railways, yes, there was even a railway between Wazirabad and Jammu. And the main route to the Kashmir Valley was from Domel and Muzaffarabad. And you know that Pir Panjal, this route used to be closed for close to 6 months of the year. So Sardar Patel himself did not pay all that kind of attention to Kashmir as he would have, but it would appear that probably Pandit Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi was more interested in getting Kashmir onto the Indian side. And they expended a certain amount of sinew, but the whole problem was I should say, the great affection or the great camaraderie between Sheikh Abdullah and Jawaharlal Nehru. What happened was that Maharaja Hari Singh, his character, I would not go into anybody, his character as delineated by his own son, Dr. Karan Singh, paints him as an indecisive person, rather haughty and proud, but not really deep into the affairs of the state or very close to his people. He was, I should say, a dyed-in-the-wool royal. I'm only using the metaphors that Dr. Karan Singh has used for his father. Well, he did demand Meher Chand Mahajan, who was then the Chief Justice of the Lahore High Court, to be posted as the Prime Minister of Jammu and Kashmir princely state. But he was denied. That seemed to have happened in around February, March. And he had, as his Prime Minister, a gentleman called Ramchandra Khan, who was very, very friendly with Jinnah somehow. And it seems that he had, for all good reason and for all practical purposes, promised Jinnah that Jammu and Kashmir would integrate with Pakistan. Well, the situation really changed after 16th August when the Radcliffe Award came into being. When the Radcliffe Award came into being, then the Gurdaspur district came to India. Firozpur district, main part of Firozpur district came to India in Punjab. That seemed to alter the entire contiguity principle, and suddenly a lot of people, especially the Kashmiris in India and also Maharaja Hari Singh, started feeling that it was impossible for Kashmir to integrate with India as well. Till that time, it seemed almost impossible. So Maharaja had a standstill agreement. That standstill agreement, India had refused to enter into a standstill agreement with the Maharaja. But he did have a standstill agreement with Pakistan, which Pakistan started violating after 15th August, or rather 16th August 1947, because Pakistan was jolted out of its complacence. Till that time, all the Pakistanis had assumed that Jammu and Kashmir had absolutely no choice except to go to them. But then suddenly, after Gurdaspur going to Punjab, Indian Punjab, whole new vista of options appeared before them. So that's where I reckon the real problem started. And then we had a scheming. There were three major characters, or the four major characters in this. There was the Maharaja, of course, he was the centerpiece. Then there was Jinnah, because he had to be there. And then there was Jawaharlal Nehru, and you had Sheikh Abdullah. Sheikh Abdullah will get great influence with Nehru because he was also the president of what is called the Provincial States Conference. And he had changed colors in the 1930s and suddenly become progressive. And becoming progressive, that meant the progressive bloc of the Indian National Congress. Jawaharlal Nehru, he became very close to him right since about 1938 or so. And Pandit Nehru would not grant any kind of concession to Maharaja unless he agreed to have Sheikh Abdullah as his prime minister. And that sort of delayed the whole situation. After that delay and dilly-dallying, the prime minister of Jammu and Kashmir playing games with Jinnah, all these kind of things happened. And it was only, I think, a few days, or 10 days before the final annexation took place, that Meherchand Mahajan finally became the prime minister of Jammu and Kashmir. But she had very little time to set things right. And that was the time when raids happened. And once the raids happened, then Maharaja was forced into some kind of what is called signing an instrument of annexation. And here I just want to make a thing clear that this instrument of annexation that was signed was exactly the same as the instrument of annexation that was signed with all the other princely states. Why? Because it was a provision in the Government of India Act 1935 that was exercised. It is in the schedule of the Government of India Act, this accession provision that was employed by Sardar Patel and Mountbatten to get all the princely states giving accession to India. So this is ultimately how the accession took place and what happened, the fighting and all that happened. But Nehru's undue affection for Sheikh Abdullah complicated the processes ever since that time. Sheikh Abdullah became some kind of an official army commander as well. After the Indian forces had flown into Kashmir, I think on the 27th of October 1947, by 15th November they had reached Uri, and Sardar Patel wanted that they go to Domel, and if they had gone to Domel beyond Muzaffarabad, that is the place where the Rawalpindi Srinagar road used to cross into the state of Kashmir, then all the things would have fallen into place. But instead, Sheikh Abdullah was playing his own games. He did not used to like the Mirpuri Muslims because there was a Muslim conference. These people used to oppose him in the valley. So he wasn't really the what is portrayed as the absolute leader of the Muslims. The Mirpuri Muslims were against him. So he just didn't want them to come on board. And Jawaharlal Nehru somehow did not realize this. I mean, all said and done, he was a very naive kind of a politician who was kind of strategically blind. That's what I've said again and again. I say that again. So that's complicated all the matter. The Sheikh Abdullah became the de facto ruler, and Maharaja Hari Singh was humiliated at every step. And that's how that whole question of the ceasefire, the Indian army not being able to evict the raiders in time, that also happened because of Sheikh Abdullah's interference. Otherwise, all the military leaders, the military leadership is on record having said that if they had been given the full cooperation by the top leadership, and the top leadership at that time included Sheikh Abdullah, then they would have evicted these people by the summer of 1948. Then there would have been no question of going to the UN and all the plebiscite and all that. Once they went to UN and the question of plebiscite came, then Sheikh Abdullah was able to blackmail all the top leadership. Why? Because he said that I am the only one who can win you the plebiscite. And that became his blackmailing chip with the Indian leadership. And that's how it went. And that's how he got the 370 in spite of the opposition of the entire Congress working committee. Even Dr. Ambedkar was against it. He's been quoted as saying that. Of course, people say that he did not. He boycotted that particular session. He did not boycott. He was present there, but he did not present it. And I think it was Ladakh Krishnaswamy Iyengar, who presented the Article 306A of the draft constitution. Article 306A of the draft constitution, which later on became the Article 370 in the final constitution. So that is the short history of Article 370A. If you ask about Article 35, that is part of the whole package. I don't know, there's a lot of misgivings about Article 35A as if it was something special. But Article 35 is part of the package of the Presidential Order of 1954. The Presidential Order of 1954 amended as many as 17 chapters of the Indian Constitution. And the way it was being operated, it was possible under Article 370 to amend any part of the Indian Constitution. So I have an issue with all these people who say that, okay, Article 35A did something surreptitious. No, it was part of that package. The Presidential Order 1954 is the one which contains that Article 35A along with so many other articles which have been amended. That's the short story of 370 and 335A.
Thank you, Sanjay ji. That was quite enlightening. I learned a few things as well. And I think, when it led to this, after 70 years of that temporary article being, there existing and then being removed, I think there was a huge support from the entire country and even around the world from the Indian diaspora. I want to go to Sunanda ji. I know you've been tracking this whole year as to how things have been going, and the way the Article 370 was applied, I think it created that whole oligarchy model there. Where Sheikh Abdullah may have started, but then we've kind of had 3 generations of their family, being there, and then another family that continued to sort of rule that state. And there was, some of those elements of pre-independence that continued to stay within that state. I wanted to ask you, Sunandaji, to sort of take us through the changes and the positive changes that happened in the state after the nullification of 370. And, it sort of ties in pretty well to the title. We deliberated a lot as to what the title should be for our panel and the conference, and we said it's a return of human rights and democracy. So I want you to take it away and talk to us about some of the things that you've seen on the ground.
Thank you, Richa-ji. I'm delighted to be here today, and it was a pleasure to listen to Sanjay-ji, who encapsulated the entire backdrop of how 370 was fraudulently brought into the Constitution and how what it was all about so eloquently. It is, the topic for today's talk, as you said, is human rights and 370. I have always said that abrogation is not suspension, but it is restoration of human rights. And I will explain to you how. And you've told me to go through the more recent events. What I'll do is, in the short 10 minutes I have, I'll tell you briefly about what has happened on the ground. And then I'll also tell you what has not happened and what I expect to happen. So as we all know, a year ago on August 5th, 2019, Article 370 for Indian Constitution and Article 35A were abrogated, put in the trash can of history, and we finally set reset button in Jammu and Kashmir and decided that finally after 7 decades, status quo must be challenged. But let me just briefly tell you what Article 370 meant on the ground before I go into all this. To constitutional experts, as Sanjay ji just pointed out, it was a riddle. To politicians in the valley, it meant a whip to keep their flock together. To minorities like me, it was a tool of suppression and oppression. And to Dogras, to Ladakhis, to Safai Karamcharis, the sanitation workers, to West Pakistan refugees, it meant something entirely different. However, there was consensus on only one point, that it is temporary, and that's what the provision said, that's how it was defined. However, over the period of time, I have seen that politicians have created a fear psychosis out of this piece of legislation, which was just a temporary piece of legislation when it was started. But the fear psychosis was at another level. It had been often communicated to people on the ground that without this article, their identity will be eroded and some terrible misfortune will befall Kashmir. In election rallies that I have seen, I have personally attended, local politicians would instigate people in the name of Article 370. They would say, Qayamat aa jayegi, or apocalypse will be threatened if 370, forget about changing or anything, or even if it is debated. So it was unnecessarily made into a super emotional issue. It had been conveyed to them, and I use these words very carefully, it was conveyed to the local Muslim population that Article 370 is their only weapon against India. It was linked to that bogus term Kashmiriya, which means nothing on the ground after 7 exoduses. What is, and completely getting the valley, the ethnic cleansing that we have seen and the genocide we have seen, Kashmiriya means nothing. It only exists in the op-ed columns of some columnists. The sad reality that is often glossed over is that because of this piece of legislation, people of the state had been kept impoverished, development remained a distant dream, and integration and assimilation with mainstream India was almost impossible. Now the question is, why would the Congress governments in the past not do anything about it? And why was this, and that is a proverbial elephant in the room, and I'm sure in the Q&A session we'll get to it, but I just want to briefly say that the reason they were not doing anything about it is because J&K was the only Muslim majority state in India. So by giving them a special status, we were actually, it was a detrimental, we were exposing our hypocrisy in denying two-nation theory of India if we were saying we are comfortable with Article 370. However, in this parameter, this debate was never framed in the liberal media circle ever, that this is actually acceptance of two-nation theory. Anyway, on August 5th, finally, Narendra Modi government did the unthinkable. I did not think this was going to happen in my lifetime, and I have to be honest about it. I think after BJP's aborted alliance with PDP, and I spoke publicly about it, and I said this is a disaster. However, I think at some point they realized that maintaining the status quo and playing these musical chairs with two valley-based political parties is no longer tenable. So it was time to remove the smoke screen. See, we have often complained about valley-based politicians speaking one thing in Kashmir, in Srinagar, and then saying another thing in Delhi. We always complain about that. But there's a reverse complaint that I have too, because I think over the years, over 7 decades, our politicians in Delhi were also saying one thing to Kashmir and one thing when they were saying Kashmir Bharat ka atut ang hai, it is an inalienable part of India. But then they were also supporting the same parties that were supporting 370 and thereby promoting separatism. So we were also speaking to the ordinary person on the ground in two different voices, and that needed to be done away with. So I think it was finally time to tell Kashmiris, Dogras, Ladakhis that they are equal citizens and enjoy all other rights, just as every citizen in India. The series of reforms that I have followed very carefully in last year tells me that this abrogation is not merely a political statement or an ideological commitment. It's both. It was an ideological commitment for BJP, and it was also a political statement. I mean, they're a political party, they're an ideological party. There was clearly that, but it was more than that. And the reason I feel it's more than that is that the first major reform that was passed was the domicile law, which increases the categories of those who can now claim a domicile status and be recognized as the stakeholders. And they had been disenfranchised earlier and kept out of the political mainstream. So this new law now paves way for every citizen of India to become domicile of J&K after 15 years of residence. Sanitation workers, Safai Karamcharis, Gorkhas, West Pakistan refugees, after years of being denied equal rights, have now been covered under new domicile law. They are now eligible for government jobs and any affirmative action guaranteed by Indian Constitution in any government-run educational institutes. Dalits in J&K were kept out of benefit that the Indian Constitution guarantees to them. Children of women who married outside J&K to non-PRC holders like me were deprived of inheritance rights. Our children could not. This was corrected in J&K High Court in 2002, but still to this day, our children could not inherit what was rightfully theirs. So, but a lot of people have said that this domicile law is, maybe it should have been done away with, and why is this 15-year, window needed? To them, I say that, what you have to look at is that it no longer takes a constitutional amendment to bring about a change in Jammu and Kashmir. So at some point, if it is realized that 15 years is too much, and we can discuss this later, a simple order can be passed, a simple executive order, and 15 years can become 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, depending on the wishes of the state and wishes of the stakeholders of the state. So it's not as big a problem of having a constitutional amendment now to change it. So this is a much smaller issue, and one can always debate about the years back and forth. And after the announcement on August 5th, the first real challenge was maintaining peace and ensuring those who benefited from status quo were effectively prevented from causing law and order issues. So Narendra Modi government, I think, did very well on that. And Srinagar remained cautiously calm. And you did not see any violence on the streets. The only, and I always say this, that the only turbulence that was seen was in international newspapers, and sparks flew in the US Congress at the behest of Pakistani lobby that we all know. Another important thing was a reality check that was given to a lot of power centers in Kashmir Valley. Not one person poured on the streets in support of the popular leaders, Abdullahs and Muftis. Their families were taking care of their Twitter accounts and their Facebook accounts, and they were all, supporting them. But real people who were on the ground, some few protests that we were seeing and are seeing to this day, was only about the information clampdown. And rightly so. I mean, people needed, I understand why there would be so much frustration about information clampdown, and I also understand why it needed to be done. But it is important to say that no masses came out for their support. Paper tigers had been exposed. Hurriyat too was unable to drum up support amongst the faithful. So, on that point at least, these people have smelled the coffee. That much I can tell you. And as I said, there was no incident of mass public violence. There is no restriction on journalists, no matter what New York Times and Washington Post tells you, there is no restriction on journalists. At the last count, 37 English dailies, 53 Urdu dailies, and 2 Kashmiri dailies are published in Kashmir. Satellite channels and cable televisions are television is fully operational. I think there is this whole talk about 4G network now, and I think at some point government will start looking into this. So you have to understand that after a major surgery, a patient goes through a convalescing process, and there's a lot of pain in the body. So think of this information clampdown as the pain of a patient after a big surgery, and obviously it will go away. Many infrastructure projects that were long pending have been started. Jammu Aknoor Road, Rambagh Flyover, all these projects have started. The iconic Dal Lake, which many of you might have seen in movies and videos, that has long battled with pollution and was dying. I was told the other day that only now J&K government has procured specialized heavy machinery to clean it. So just to end this is what has happened on the ground roughly. But next round of reforms should address the question of displaced Kashmiri Hindus. I think the domicile law brings a sense of ownership in all stakeholders, but rehabilitation of Kashmiri Hindus still remains a question mark. They have been forced into exile by a brutal jihadi terrorism, which engulfed the valley. Valley still struggles with terrorism. So should we wait? Should my people wait till the last gun falls silent, or should there be a roadmap considered for the dignified return? I think that is what we need to, those things need to now start. And something that I have been asking for since 2014 is a truth commission. I have always said that I requested the government, and maybe through your platform, you all can join me in saying that an SIT, a special investigation team, should be set up on that will prepare a white paper that will be presented in the parliament on the things that happened in J&K, in Kashmir Valley in 1989-90 that led to the ethnic cleansing of Kashmiri Hindus, and this only exodus that has happened, only ethnic cleansing and only exodus that has happened in post-independent India. Unless that is done, I do not see this going too far, because we really need to be able to tell the truth to ourselves. And I don't think people should be held ransom for the geography and strategic location of the place they were born in. There's time now to make all these changes that, all those who invested in the perpetual conflict have no place in deciding the future of Jammu and Kashmir. I will leave with that, and I think I'm not sure if I went about time, but I'll be happy to take the question and answers.
I think you did perfect timing. And I'm so glad you brought up the domicile law, because, that is always hanging up in the air. People are, talking a lot about it. And it's good to know that, what you think is that there's a lot more flexibility now.
Yes.
With how we can attend to any sort of changes and timeframes, etc. And also the SIT, I think we should go further, and, as we go into our discussion, to discuss more on that. So I want to go to Sanjay ji now. Sanjay ji, I know you're a legal expert as well. And, the other controversy that is going on, and which it might help to, throw some light on, is the union territory part of it. I know Ladakh always wanted to be a union territory, and maybe Jammu and Kashmir was a little bit blindsided and, wanted, people have various opinions. I wanted to get your opinion on, what you think, maybe was, just delve into Amit Shah and, Modi ji's mind and see what did they accomplish by bringing that element into fray. And secondly, also the constitutionality. I think that's just touch upon a little bit on, there was again a controversy around that this is not constitutionally correct to nullify the 370. So just, touch upon it a little bit, as you answer.
I'm always intrigued by the definition of controversy. Because, one odd guy standing up and saying something.
I call it non-troversy. I've coined a word called non-troversy.
So that becomes a controversy. And our leftist media, of course, is an expert in this. There's nothing against which it doesn't raise a voice. Everything is a controversy. So that being that, let me supplement Sunandaji with which he mentioned about the two-nation theory. And I have said it for many years, it's there on record, that Article 370 was Jawaharlal Nehru's concession to the two-nation theory. And I would like to revise it now, that it was actually Jawaharlal Nehru's confirmation of the two-nation theory. And even though they always kept denying, as Sunandaji rightly said, they always said that they opposed the two-nation theory, but they ultimately agreed to the Mountbatten Plan and the Indian Independence Act 1947 on the basis of that two-nation theory. And they always seem to harbor that inferiority complex. And it is also in tune with the entire narrative that went in before the partition, that actually led to the partition. And that was what Dr. Ambedkar had very succinctly defined it in two sentences. The first sentence was, the Muslim politics in India is gangsters' politics. And the second was that the Indian National Congress doesn't know the difference between appeasement and settlement. So with that deadly combination, the deadly cocktail of these two, they successfully managed to get the partition, and not only get the partition, but they got the wrong end of the stick for the Hindus everywhere.
East Pakistan, Pakistan, everywhere, or in Kashmir. Everywhere they got the worst. And if you look at the kind of massacres that happened in the Mirpur Kotli area because of the delay in dispatching the forces, and the delay happened entirely on account of Sheikh Abdullah not agreeing or not giving the direction, because Mountbatten had told the commander at that time, the commander of the Jammu and Kashmir theatre, that you have to take the clearance from Sheikh Abdullah to be able to move your forces. And he would not allow them to move into Mirpur and Kotli area. And something like 20,000, 30,000 people were massacred in one day. So all those things are part of the historical record, and they're very graphically described in my book. Anyone can look at that and look at those record, and also look at the inadequacy of the forces of the Jammu and Kashmir state. The Jammu and Kashmir state had about 10,000, 12,000 forces. And in that Mirpur area alone, about 50, 60,000 forces have been demobilized from the World War II, and all of them had been given their weapons. So Jammu and Kashmir was never going to be able to face these demobilized forces, who were all Muslims, and supported by the Sufi elements across the border. The what is called the Peer of Manki Sharif was very much arousing everybody and provoking everybody. And of course, that famous, what is called the General Tariq. One sec. I think there's something wrong with camera. I'll just start the camera again. So all this was happening. The Muslim element of Maharaja forces were defecting. They were killing their own compatriots. All these things were happening, and Sheikh Abdullah was barely dancing around or playing the communist in the valley, playing the communist in the Jammu region, and playing the nationalist in Delhi. And that sort of a thing was being fought by these so-called seasoned freedom fighters. They were not seasoned freedom fighters. They were absolutely naive. That is one. So that is supporting Sunandaji's, what Sunandaji said. The next part on the constitutionality part. I have not the slightest of doubt. Again, in the book, I have detailed it out. There are 5 constitutional bench judgments. There are 2 Lakhanpal judgments, P.L. Lakhanpal. One P.L. Lakhanpal versus State of Jammu and Kashmir, P.L. Lakhanpal versus the President. One is the Premnath call. Then there is the Sampath Kumar judgment, which was dealing with the 1965 presidential order. And the 1965 presidential order was very interesting because that was the one that amended the Article 367 using the Article 370. And by doing that, what they did was that they removed the Sadr Riyasat, brought in the governor, and removed the prime minister, and brought in the chief minister. So if that could be done, then whatever has been done by the Home Minister Amit Shah in nullifying this Article 370, using Article 370, is the same route. They amended the 367 first, redefined the Legislative Assembly, and after redefining they redefined the Constituent Assembly. After redefining the Constituent Assembly, they used the Legislative Assembly, the word Legislative Assembly. Now, Parliament is the Legislative Assembly when there is a President's rule. They went to the Parliament, got the resolution passed, and they did not abrogate. I mean, this is the wrong term that people use. The Article 370 is not been abrogated, it is still in the Constitution, but without its teeth.
Yes.
There's no, just says that Article 370, as it exists today, it actually says that Article 370 applies all the provisions of the Constitution to the state of, or to the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir. And once Article 370 goes, the Constitution applies, then Article 3 also applies. Virtue of Article 3, you can change a state into a Union Territory using the Legislative Assembly. And the Legislative Assembly under the President's rule is the Parliament. So there is absolutely no question about the constitutionality of the Article 370. And when it comes to it, you will see. And anybody who reads my book, it will be absolutely clear because I have detailed out all the judgments. And I've given the, one can see that. And there was another part of your question. There was one more part.
I think I was talking about the Union Territory. That accomplished,
yes,
you
so
know,
that
the creation of the Union.
Yeah, I dealt with that. What else was there? I've dealt with the Union Territory part.
No, I think that's it then.
So we can move on to the.
So yeah, we can move on to. I think for me these are like the two very interesting questions because, and I'll just throw both of them out. One is for Sunanda ji and one is for Sanjay ji. Sunanda ji, my question is mainly, I know you as a Kashmiri Pandit, and I know so many Kashmiri Pandits. I think there is a pain that, you know, the narrative so far, even though we have, you know, after Modi ji's government, we have, this topic has come to the fore, but still, the narrative is still all about as if, you know, right now there's a Muslim genocide going on and the, you know, the phone and the internet. I mean, I've seen tweets from some of the American, you know, politicians talking about this, and we've tried to, you know, do our own little Twitter storm to counter that and talk to them. But you know, how do we shape that narrative? Secondly, what do you think it's going to take to, you know, to rehabilitate, if ever, the Kashmiri Pandit back into the valley? And also, you know, the incidents that happened with the Ajay Pandita's, you know, death and the lack of security cover. I mean, do you see a lot of bitterness around that? And, you know, do you think there was something that could have been done? I think those are just, and also you talked about the SIT for, you know, just an investigation, which I think would be a good way to sort of heal, you know, bring about that emotional and psychological healing. So do you, how do you see that shaping up in the future? Do you see hope?
Two questions. First, you talked about the narrative that, Kashmiri Hindus, you know, this is the only ethnic cleansing that has been witnessed in independent India. This is the only exodus that has been witnessed in independent India. Yet, we don't get, for the lack of the word, we don't get the sympathy that we deserve in the international media from the organizations that talk about human rights, that don't talk, that, you know, that stand up for, people who have been marginalized by the mainstream. Yet we don't get to get any platform there, or we don't get any sympathy there. And there's a reason for this, I think. I think we belong to the wrong faith. because a lot of people understand wrong. When I say wrong, I mean quote unquote wrong faith from their point of view, because there is a whole consensus and there is a whole thing about leftist and Islamist media right now. Leftist, liberal and Islamist media, they're all together because they have they have the same enemies. Once that enemy goes away, then they will fight with each other also, that there's no question about that. But right now, because they have a similar same enemy, and in India it happens to be Hindus, so they have gotten together, they have ganged up against us. And in the international media, because a lot of people don't understand, I will tell you, I have spoken on so many international forums, and Sanjay, you will be surprised, and Richa, you will be surprised. They don't even know the geography of Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir. They think just those 4 districts, troublesome districts, that is Kashmir Valley. They don't realize that Kashmir is a lot more than that. They don't understand that Kashmiri Muslims, the troublemakers really are just the Sunni Muslims of Valley. There are other people or other ethnicities also. There are people like us, Kashmiri Hindus. There are Dogras. There are Ladakhis till now. So they forget. There are Gujars, Bakarwals, who are the scheduled caste community. People forget all that. They just think that this is just these 4 districts is entire Kashmir problem. So first of all, you have to educate them on the geography. Second point, they think that because Hindus are a majority in India and a minority in Jammu and Kashmir, they just don't have some of them do it on purpose, but a lot of people here, the lawmakers, the European lawmakers or the American lawmakers, they don't understand it quite well, that a same community can be minorities. Hindus can be minorities in Jammu and Kashmir, and they can be majority in mainland India, but that does not mean anything. There is a whole difference there. But then they are fed by those 5 people. Mr. Modi calls it Khan market consensus. They're just fed by those 5 coterie of people. Fortunately, in India, those 5 people who are the sources for New York Times and Washington Post, they are their sole readers also. So 5 people who provide the news, they read the news also. So you will not find any of this in India. There is absolutely no traction for this nonsense anymore. But outside here, I have seen in the international platforms, we have to break that consensus. Somehow we have to tell them our story. We have to go. And one of these things we would done in, you would have seen after Article 370, how much it has been intensified. Not one positive news about India has come after Article 370. I won't use the abrogation word because Sanjay is right. It has not been abrogated. So it's still there. But after this change, you will not see one positive article. In fact, I tell these people that all these writers all these journalists who are reporting from Srinagar, they are all reporting under their own byline. This is a very important point, Richa. They are all reporting under their byline. These are not reports that are coming from anywhere else. So, or these are anonymous reports. So, and these people are formulating their response based on these reports that are coming from stringers that are in Kashmir Valley. So my question is, either there is censorship or there isn't. How can both be true? Either there is censorship that you are not getting any information at all, or your information is based on the people who are sending you information. There clearly is no gagging there. So one of the two can only be true. Either the government can censor or the government cannot censor. So all this is basically just, the way to, Hindus are not really, people who get sympathy in the overall leftist domain. And this is a fight that we have to keep fighting. We are fighting it the political front. We have to fight it on the civil society front. We have to fight it in media. We have to fight it in academia. In media and academia, it is extremely difficult to fight it. But it is something that we have to we have to use to our you have to work on. Technology is a great benefit. What you are doing today, Richa, would have been impossible 5 years ago. So none of us would have been able to talk. But the fact that technology is giving us ways to speak, so this is what we can use to our advantage. And this is what we should rely on. I think the whole story of Kashmiri Pandits was completely drowned from 1990 till for about 15 years. It was completely drowned. You would never even hear about it. When I came to, when my family, I was a young girl, when my family came to Delhi, we were looking for houses to live in. So people would tell us that, सच में आप आए हैं, ऐसे कोई घर छोड़ के आता है क्या? People did not even, because there was only Doordarshan and Z News had not even started. I mean, Z News was the first private television, but that had not also started. So the only news you were getting was Doordarshan news, which was government regulated news. So people were actually asking us, who leaves their homes of 5,000 years? You must be bluffing. How does that even happen? So, we have come from there to the point when this early days of blogging, when some of us started writing and narrating our experiences, then internet, of course, got in. From there. We went to social media and everything that opened the gates for us. So that is what we should do. We should use the technology to rebut with facts, because facts are on our side and nobody can deny. You can do all the propaganda in the world. Ultimately, facts will rule. So that was your one part. The second part you asked about, what about the rehabilitation of Kashmiri Pandits? Richa, rehabilitation is not going to happen, and I can assure you, rehabilitation and reconciliation is not going to happen unless you tell the truth. And Indian government still shies from saying why this exodus happened. And I don't understand why. They need to be able to set up a SIT. They need to be able to get reports. Some of us, a lot of a generation is dying. My grandmother's generation is dying. I mean, they are in the last stages of they're in the winter of their lives. They will lose some important information if we don't begin now. My mother's generation, the memory is getting weaker. And my generation, who was the last one to see, we've seen a lot of it. I have seen a lot of it, but the kind of information that you would get from the two generations before me is now dying. And that's very important that the government moves on this. And it's not just for our generation, it's not just for our rehabilitation, but it is also for the posterity to know what happens to a region where demographics are skewed like this, where from 100%, you go to near 0%, the population, then what happens to those people? They don't just disappear. What happened to those people? And the kind of testimony I gave in US Congress, I would like to give that testimony in my parliament to my lawmakers. Somebody has to provide that platform. Yes. Why do I need to go? I mean, clearly, yes, I do need to make a testimony everywhere else, but I would like my lawmakers to know before anybody else. So it's a cruel joke that we are not speaking to our lawmakers. They're not listening to our stories. They're not putting these stories together, because then we will not be migrants anymore. We are not migratory birds. Even in the information or official communication that comes from the government, every time they talk about Kashmiri Hindus, they talk about migrants. We did not migrate. We were thrown out. So first of all, we need to get the nomenclature right. After that, we need to get why we need to have this one official story about why we left, because the Muslims in Kashmir have spent, even the younger children who were born after 1990, they have been fed this unfortunate narrative that the then governor of Jammu and Kashmir, Jagmohan, he somehow formulated this whole thing. This was a time when there were not every family even had a phone, that land phone. Forget about cell phones and forget about WhatsApps and forget everything. But they somehow make it that, he formed some big conspiracy and he put us all in trucks and he left. My own family did not leave till August. The exodus began after 19th January 1990. I'm sure yesterday you must have gone through all that. The exodus began right after that. Majority people left, but my family was there till August 1990 because we were still holding on to some hope. And after August 1990, when one of my uncles was shot at in March, we had no hope. We had to leave. So it wasn't like we did not even have a land phone. Even those land phones were not available those days. It was very difficult to get. MTNL को रिश्वत खिलानी पड़ती थी phone लेने के लिए. So there were no phones. There was no way to communicate to anybody. So how would one governor who had still not come to Kashmir, he was still in Jammu, in one day decide this whole thing? But all these cruel things are happening. All this is being said again and again and again because no government has not moved on this SIT and government has not moved on this white paper. So until that happens, I don't see any rehabilitation. That's my point. I think we lost Richa here.
Am I still there?
Right, yeah.
Yeah. I think just in time.
Yeah.
I have a little bit of a technical issue. But I guess Sunandaji, that was straight from the heart, and clarion call for the Indian government to do something about, giving us a platform, even in India, which of course here it was a very skewed and biased platform. We need something where we can raise our voices in our home. And Sanjay ji, I guess this would probably be the last question of our show today. And I wanted to actually talk to you about something, for you to talk to us about, the article that you wrote, the Medium article, which sort of went viral, and it was probably 1 million views over at the probably last year exactly, isn't it? And
Yeah,
you
I think 25th of August.
Yes. So the existential crisis for Pakistan, the nullification of 370 pretty much nullifies the raison d'etre for Pakistan to exist. And, I have heard voices from Parvez Boy and Dr. Bengali and others from the other side as well, talking about two-nation theory being now, in the doldrums. Now, do you want to enlighten us on that? Like, what do you think was the basis of the two-nation theory, and how does 370 really change that dynamic?
The two-nation theory basically comes from the binary that is inherent in the Islamic doctrine, which views the whole world as a believer and unbeliever. And for them, the definition of a nation is the Ummah. And the Ummah is the larger Islamic community, the larger global Islamic community, in theory. So that's the theory. And that theory gained ground after the collapse of the Mughal Empire. Because after the collapse of Mughal Empire, the real power went away from the Mughals to the Marathas. And then a lot of these, what I call the Ashrafia class, because all the clerics, all the major clerics, what I call the muftis, there's a typical doctrine in the Hanafi Islam, and that Hanafi Islam doctrine is called taqleed. Taqleed means that the lay public is not supposed to use the aql. Aql means reason. The reason is prohibited. So the public is prohibited from exercising any reason in matters of religion. And in Islam, everything is religion. The religion encompasses the everyday activity, and that's what, if you look at the things like Fatwa Alamgiri, Fatwa Razviya, the Hadith, and all that, everything from how to sleep, how to eat, and every little thing, how to do namaz, how to copulate, everything is detailed out, and people seek fatwas on every aspect of their existence. Even things like how to spit on the right side, on the left side, how to smell, it's ridiculous actually if you start to do it. But then public is supposed to exercise the aql or reason. That's why they want to ask their muftis for everything. The mufti is the one who is authorized to issue fatwa. And all these muftis, they belong to the what is called the Ashrafia, or the elite class of the Muslims in Hanafi Islam. And they style themselves as sheikhs and sayyids, and that's how they work. So if you look at the entire doctrine that has been codified and solidified after Aurangzeb in Fatawa Alamgiri, then or Hidayah of the Barelvis. The Barelvis were the major forces who supported Jinnah for partition. And if you look at their doctrines, they have even a chapter called nafrat ke ahkamat, that means the commandments of hatred. So they even detail out how to hate you. No, so it's that detailed. And one of the guiding doctrines is that anything that pleases a kafir or anything that gives solace to a kafir is kufr. That is, it's prohibited. It's a sin. So that being the case, the two-nation doctrine is always inherent. And in India, it played out as what is called a minority narrative. The entire Pakistan movement happened and was strongest in the provinces where Muslims were minority. It wasn't a majority narrative because majority was very comfortable anyway. In Punjab and Bengal, they had no issues. They were dominant, so they had no issues. So all this narrative played out in places like UP and Bombay and Delhi, such places. And the doctrine, as I have detailed out again, I keep referring to my book because I have done a major work on this and detailed out everything, how this doctrine plays out. So this doctrine plays out in this manner. And the two-nation theory, it divides the humanity into two. So why would it not divide a subcontinent into two? Then I quoted Dr. Ambedkar. And there is also, I often quote, and I think here I can quote again, H.V. Seshadri, who was an RSS ideologue. He said this beautifully, that in the pre-partition days, there were two behaviors which collaborated to make partition a reality. And what were these two behaviors? They said there was a Muslim behavior pattern and there was a national behavior pattern. So that the Muslim behavior pattern consisted of, in that order, acrimony, accusations, then what is called complaints, then demands, denunciation, and street riots. And this street riots business really magnified after that national behavior pattern of what is called assent, acquiescence, cajolery, cowardice, self-reproach, and surrender. That was exemplified by the Indian National Congress in the 1920s when they decided to join the Khilafat non-cooperation movement that was set into motion on the 1st August 1920 by passing a resolution in CWC in September. And something as absurd as the Khilafat and anti-democracy movement was joined by a party which was battling for democracy for their own people. There cannot be anything more absurd than that. And these two behavior patterns which I mentioned, you can just put them together. And once you put them together, then the inevitability of partition is made out. Unfortunately, they did not learn anything. The naive Jawaharlal Nehru continued with the same policies. And some kind of a reflection of those policies is available even today. Even after such strong measures as nullification of Article 370, enactment of CAA, a recognition that the partition as it happened was totally adverse to Hindus who were given no choice, whereas Muslims had a choice. Muslims had a choice either to go to Pakistan or to stay back in India. The Hindus in reality had no choice because in an Islamic state, which actually declared itself to be a fully Islamic state, which would and declared its intentions in its objectives resolution. It mentioned that the sovereignty of the universe belongs to Allah alone. That's a Quranic prescription. So once you have a Sharia kind of a state or quasi Sharia state, then non-believers they have to either live as zimmis, the second-class citizens, or they have to migrate out. They really have no choice. In Kashmir, they did the same experiment. And they have been doing the same experiment, not from today, but from 14th century. In 14th century, the time of Sikandar Butshikan, the great Sufi Shah Hamadan, people call Kashmirian. So whenever they call Kashmirians and they praise Kashmirian, then I give the example of Shah Hamadan and his code of Umar, which he implemented. in Kashmir. Actually, he gave the code, and his son implemented along with Sikandar Chicken, broke all the temples, and actually it's codified. Again, we don't have the time to read it out here, but it's there in my book. It's the same thing that ultimately all the sultans were Khiljis, Lodhis, or your Aurangzeb, or all of these people, they implemented the same code. And in Kashmir, they utilize the same code. If they say Raliv, Galiv, Chaliv, then they're not saying anything new. This is being said for 1300 years to non-believers everywhere. The only sad part of this was that this was being done in a supposedly independent republic, where Hindus were minority in a small part, and even in that small part, they were not allowed to live and survive. That is the tragedy of the whole situation. And as Sunandaji says, the Truth Commission or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I mean, this is a Holocaust. This is nothing less than Holocaust. This is a genocide. And these are not one genocide. These are 7 genocides. And nobody is ready to talk about them. How can you ignore them? That is why when I started talking about Article 370 in this book, let me show this book to your viewers. In this book, then I listed out all the 7 exoduses. All the 7 exoduses, starting from the first one, Sikandar Chicken, then that Fateh Shah, the second one in the beginning of the 16th century, then the Durrani one, the third one, then, the third one was Aurangzeb, the fourth one was during Durrani. All of these genocide, all of these are genocide. Then the 5th one is as recent as 1931. 3 of the 7 genocides are in the 20th century. In 1931, that Yom-e-Shahada, which was celebrated with such great fanfare in Jammu and Kashmir, and which was actually a state holiday. What was that? That was a riot by the Muslims against the Hindus. That was celebrated as a great event until today, until the nullification of Article 370. Then you had a creeping exodus. Over 30 years, there was an exodus. That is the 6th exodus. And the 7th exodus was the latest one that all of us know so very much about. Right. Or rather, not so very much about. And there is need to educate public, and there is need to tell them at least about the 7th exodus first, before we go to the previous 6. And Sunandaji is very right. There is no greater disinfectant than sunlight. Unless the truth comes out, unless you have some kind of a Holocaust study in the manner it was done in Germany, then there can be no reconciliation. Because this is a doctrine, Islam is a doctrine that officially, I'm not joking, it's written in the in Sahih Bukhari, that any deception or any lie that advances the cause of Islam against kafir is permissible. So that lie is being worked out beautifully. And we feel apologetic, and we feel that we need to be politically correct. In fact, I write a column in one of the new portals that's come out of the US. It's called Creately. And my column is called Politically Incorrect. So if someone tells me that you have to come on my show and you have to be politically correct, I generally politely decline. This time I was told a little bit late.
But no, we are definitely going to link to your articles on the Kohna website, Sanjay ji. So I think people will get to see and read them as we go along. I think this was a great, we are sort of running out of time, but this could go on and on, because it's such an emotional issue, as well as, there's so much information behind this, so much history behind it. And I think we shed a lot of light on it today. And I think we should leave it at the point that, a lot of cataloging is required. A lot of, voices need to be heard on this, and we need to keep that effort going and that pressure going that, this message has to reach and become the mainstream narrative, because, this cannot be ignored. It was a genocide, not once, but 7 times. And, this has to be acknowledged. And, the voice of the Kashmiri Pandit has to be heard. And I think today we did some of that in this panel. So I want to thank you, Sunanda ji. Thank you, Sanjay ji, for being part of this great discussion. I really am honored to have been here for an hour with you guys. Thank you.
And thank you to all. Fantastic discussions and fantastic conversations. We can go at this for another few hours, and we would not be running out of content. So really appreciate everyone's time today. And Richa ji, thank you for moderating as well. And we'll move on to our next panel. Namaskar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we just heard from some eminent experts about Article 370, the dynamics around it, the historic concerns around Article 370 after the nullification of Article 370. What has been the progress, and what are some of the changes that are needed from the Indian government that Kashmiri Pandits are asking for? Our next group of panelists and next group of speakers are from the Kashmiri Pandit youth community. They're going to be sharing their perspectives about what they have been sharing after Article 370 amongst their particular community, but also amongst the wider youth audience, how their voices have been either silenced or have been gagged by various types of forums. They've been called all kinds of names, which is very unfortunate, because every other group that has been subject to genocide or persecution does get voice out there in the media, in the academia, etc. However, it is unfortunate to see that Kashmiri Pandit youth are being targeted for just speaking about what their ancestors have felt. So with that, I want to welcome everybody. Let me add everybody to the stream. I want to welcome all. Namaskar.
Namaskar.
This panel is going to be moderated today by Parth Parihar. Parth is the Director of Advocacy for Hindu Students Council and its former president. He is also a PhD student at Princeton University and has been involved in Hindu activities since his childhood. Welcome, Parth.
Namaste.
And Nisha Kusba is a Kashmiri Pandit who was born and raised in Maryland and now lives in Washington, D.C. She has been a strong advocate to continuously keep the Kashmiri Pandit voice and plight heard and never be forgotten. Since August 5th of last year, the vilification of Kashmiri Pandits and the Hindu-phobic rhetoric has been on the rise and normalized. Between the media propaganda of the West and the absence of the Kashmiri Pandit narrative, a lopsided view of Kashmir has been peddled. Through talks like this and open forums, many Kashmiri Pandit youth, including Nisha, hope to provide insights that our parents' generation could not do as they were struggling to rebuild lives for the past 30 years. And I've personally seen this. Nisha, you're facing this backlash on campuses in some of the teaching sessions and things like that. So welcome.
Thank you.
Yep. You might want to raise your volume a little bit, by the way. Next, we have Rohit.
Can you hear me now better?
Yes, better.
Okay.
And finally, we have Rohit Raina. Rohit is a Texas-based Kashmiri Pandit youth. Rohit has been active in the Kashmiri Pandit community since he was a child, going to annual events and interacting with families around the nation. He is also a Texas A&M graduate with 2 degrees in biochemistry and genetics. And Rohit, pleasure having you here as well. So Parth, take it away from here.
Thanks so much, Nikunjbhai, and thank you so much to Rohit and Nisha for agreeing to be on this panel. Thank you so much, guys. So this panel, which is part of Kashmir, A Return of Human Rights and Democracy, will look at the ways in which the issue of the abrogation of Article 370 and the subsequent narratives about Kashmir have impacted Kashmiri American youth, living in the diaspora but very connected with their Kashmiri Hindu roots. And so before we get into, Nisha and Rohit, all of the things that have happened over the past year, I wanted to just begin by asking you guys, what has been the experience like of living in the US as a Kashmiri Hindu American, as somebody who very strongly identifies with your Kashmiri background, but who has been unable to really live, visit, and inhabit that space?
You can go first.
Okay. So first of all, thank you, Parth, for having us here. Just to start off, my name is Rohit, and I was actually born in Janipur, Jammu, Jammu, Kashmir, and I moved here just a year after, pretty young age. So I'm pretty much an American citizen. And growing up in America, it's very easy to lose yourself because it's a big melting pot of cultures here. Our neighbors are so diverse, and there's a whole bunch of things. You go to school, you see a whole bunch of different environments, but you don't ever see a Kashmiri environment outside of your house. So as I grew up, I found myself kind of intertwined between two different worlds. One would be the home, and one would be outside of the home. But I never once kind of let myself fall into the losing the one identity for another. I formed an intersectional kind of identity. And when I was a kid, I didn't really understand much of Kashmir's past or, anything my parents would say to me, really. All I knew was how to speak Kashmiri, and that's it. And so growing up, we did do festivals and everything. I never understood the significance of them. It was kind of like when your parents have to drag you to a temple service or these things. That's how it felt growing up. But as I matured on around high school, by the time I got to college, that's when these things started hitting to me. And I realized more about the significance of all the festivals we partake in, such as Gardabat, Navre, Shivaratri, these big festivals that we do. And it's very easy to forget to do that. I myself have seen a lot of communities not partake in festivals, but I'm fortunate enough to have grown up in that thing and understand how that was. And so throughout my life, I kind of built up into it. And then post August 5th, 2019, that's when everything kind of just came and put together. And that's when I've been more vocal about these things.
Yeah, so I think most people, can you hear me, or is my volume still low?
It's good.
Perfect. So I think one thing I've always been very proud of is being a Kashmiri Pandit that grew up in a household with my parents and obviously my sister, but all my four grandparents. And as a kid, I never really understood what that really meant. And I took it for granted. And I think it's the one thing I treasure the most is I was able to grow up with them. But I also, as I got older, I realized that the reason I had that privilege was actually at the hands of them losing their own home, because they had no home of their own. And so many Kashmiri Pandit families had that happen to them, where, their grandparents or parent generation were going from one household to another, just trying to rebuild their life. So I think ever since I was a kid, most of my friends know I'm Kashmiri, my colleagues know I'm Kashmiri. It's like definitely wear it on my sleeve. I've always have. It didn't take August 5th for me to do that. I grew up being very proud of it. I do think I never realized what people actually thought about India and how Hindu-phobic the Western media was. I think last year really shined light on that. And for the first time, our story was questioned and denied. And for someone who grew up with grandparents who lived through it, obviously my grandparents aren't lying. My family friends' grandparents aren't lying. They're living proof of it. But for the first time, I was hearing folks questioning it. And I remember last year when I went to one of the teach-ins, someone asked me, well, what's your proof it happened? And what are the numbers? And going from like an academic standpoint, it's like, yeah, but these aren't just numbers for your research project or for your Al Jazeera article. These are our family's stories. And it really invigorated me, and then made me kind of continuously go to these teach-ins over and over again. I happen to live in Washington, D.C., which is the precipice of policy and politics. My livelihood is also in policy. So it happened to be a nice intersection for me to have a voice for my people and for my community, and honestly for my own family. It has been difficult. I think our story a couple of things I've heard is, one, it happened 30 years ago, as if that's super ancient. When we talk about all the other exoduses, those are just like, whoa, really far in the past, like kind of get over it. And why aren't you focusing on 2020? And then nobody wants to listen to what has brought Kashmir to what it is in 2020. So it's been pretty difficult, I will say, to actually get our voice heard, to answer your question part, and be
Yeah,
taken
absolutely.
seriously.
Absolutely. And I wanted to ask you, based on what you just related, whether that is something new, whether that's something that's happened over the past year, since a lot of this narrativization has happened through organizations like Stand with Kashmir, or if that's something that you and your family had also faced before that's just kind of gone into overdrive, or is this something new?
To be really honest, I had never been in forums or teach-ins where it was questioned, because my whole, as Rohit said, our family circle or our family friend circle is very Kashmiri Pandit. So it was never questioned, right? But I think it opened my eyes. I think when I spoke to uncles and aunties about my experience, they weren't very surprised. So personally, I was surprised, but not the generations that came before, who I know a lot of the KPs, at least in the DC area when 1990 happened, had really tried to advocate at DC, at Congress and at the Hill, and kind of faced very similar rhetoric. So it definitely isn't new. It just kind of went dormant for a while, and then August 5th happened.
Right, absolutely. And what about you, Rohit? What was your experience like in terms of the denial that Kashmiri Pandits face, and in terms of the gaslighting? Is this something that is new based on what happened this year, or is that something that you had also experienced before?
So mine's a little different from Nisha, but at the same time pretty similar. I did not really face much of a backlash till August 5th last year, because a lot more of my friends were kind of understanding of the issue, and they've honestly, a lot of them don't know much about India. Even my Indian friends don't know too much about India, and let alone Kashmir. So when I tell them these things, they're kind of pretty understanding, and they actually want to learn more, and then they kind of understand the narrative. But once August 5th came, and I noticed that there was a hidden narrative behind a lot of people's minds, that there wasn't a big pro-India, pro-Hindu mindset. It was more or less like, we have a narrative and it's not helping your cause whatsoever, because our cause is ignored in their narrative. So once that abrogation of the Article 370 occurred, that's when I started to become very vocal on more social media platforms, such as Twitter and Instagram, and even Reddit, which is not too favorable for our side either. So it was then, that's when I started getting a lot of gaslighting experiences. Just 2 months ago, Parth and Nisha were there, and people were telling me that I'm not allowed to go back. There's no space for me anymore, or I'm a cow piss drinker. That these genocides didn't happen. They're quoting some books that were debunked actually, and they refuse to believe them. So it's now it's like they're telling me that I was never native to my own land, and the 7 exoduses did not occur, and that my parents are lying to me. And it really is time to push forward this narrative. Exactly. We need to kind of break the cycle, because what narrative is here now, such as sources like Al Jazeera, The Wire, New York Times, especially Washington Post, a lot of them are, I wouldn't say anti-Hindu, but yes, they're anti-Hindu. They really don't play for our plight. And it takes a lot of our voice just to make something heard, and it really shouldn't be this case. So
I would like to add, thinking about just our existence, right? Like, forget what happened in 1990. I think because it is so strong, if you read any headline or any of the first even sentences of any article that talks about Kashmir, it always says Kashmir, a Muslim majority state, and then continues, right? And so with that, I understand that it is a Muslim majority state, but there also are other minorities, such as Hindus. It's something super simple. An article was written by Kashmiri Pandit about her mother's recipe on Rogan Josh, which is a novelty for Kashmiris, Hindu or Muslim, doesn't matter. And her name is obviously Hindu, but it's a very typical Kashmiri Pandit name with the last name, I believe, Mattu. And someone commented on her that, what a time to be appropriating Kashmiri culture. Like, basically insinuating that how can someone who's non-Kashmiri be talking about, having this lavish cuisine that's Kashmiri? And she is a Kashmiri. She's brought up in a Kashmiri household. That's basically what the whole article is about. But what I worry is that we are so forgotten that forget even 1990, all the exoduses, our sheer existence is like, no, you can't possibly be Kashmiri because you're not what we think Kashmir is, which is a Muslim majority state, which it is, but there's also everybody else, and we're just as Kashmiri, but we're questioned and we're denied. And something, I just think that the article was so non-controversial. It was literally just about, a cultural appreciation for her own culture, and she was immediately told that she was appropriating. And that gets for me, that's super scary. Then it's like, oh, then we don't really even exist.
Yeah, absolutely. And this isn't the first time that's happened to Kashmiri Pandits. And I know that, Rohit, you have a couple of examples, one that you alluded to already about that happening when you're just talking about something that is very real and that has happened to your family. Nisha, you said something a little bit earlier that I just want to focus on for just a couple minutes, which is, when Kashmiri Pandits, they bring up what happened in 1990 or they bring up the previous exoduses, they're told to not live in the past, right? That this is something that happened, you should get over it. And that's something that's very common whenever Hindus in general bring up the transgenerational trauma. But specific to Kashmiri Pandits, how is what happened in 1990 relevant for how we still think about Kashmir today, like at a broader level? When we think about the ways that the Azadi movement is being portrayed or being thought about, and also how is it relevant to your families? So there's a couple ways in which like the genocide connects, right? It's both in a broader geopolitical sense and then it's also at a personal level. So could you guys comment on like why it's really important to still think about your genocide in 2020?
Sure, I can go ahead. So the pro-Azadi movement, while on paper looks great, a lot of things on paper look amazing. But translating into real life is never that easy. First of all, advocating for a free Kashmir or a pro-Azadi kind of mindset is what killed us, literally killed us. The last time someone said, free Kashmir, we had 3 genocides. So this mindset of having an isolated Kashmir is religiously racist. It's just advocating for one religion, that would be Islam, and no space for the rest, because they were literally, like, my parents wouldn't lie. My mom was witness to mosques in the speakers, loud blaring, Ralif, Salif, Tigalu, convert, flee or die. And that's been going on for a long time. And this whole formulation of wanting to be a separatist mind, the separatist mindset is not what allows our freedom. It allows just one person's freedom. And that's kind of not going to play for our benefit. And economically, Kashmir being itself, it couldn't live on its own. Even in 1947, when Maharaj Hari Singh wanted to be independent, he realized he couldn't, because once Pakistan sent terrorist groups to attack Kashmir, they had no army to prepare themselves. They really had they'd have no economical background besides tourism and agriculture, and that cannot thrive a system on its own. So a pro-Azadi movement it's honestly traumatic to us as Hindus, because we're living examples of why that wouldn't work, and why the narrative that preaching for a free state isn't always the best thing. There are examples where it works, such as Tibet and Hong Kong, because they're so well off and they have such big systems to work with. But in cases like ours, having a free mindset and these things is not just toxic for an environment, but it's toxic to another faith, and that won't always work for us.
Yeah, so I had a couple of thoughts come into mind, and I think in the generation that we're in right now, between the cusp of millennials and then Gen Z and this whole social justice movement that's happening throughout the world for different reasons, right? Whether it's in the United States or even in India, I think what has become the more woke and fashionable way of thinking is looking at freedom movements as being pure and to be coming like out of the ashes of oppression. And for many instances, as Rohit said, it's very true. But what happens is that in India, specifically looking at Kashmir, the freedom fight is not this pure, unadulterated movement. It is, I think that's where our voice is so important, is because when you shed light to happenings of 1990, you start to kind of gleam into, wait, what is the movement really about? And many of the chants that were sung then during the protests and even now are very tied to Islam, where it's talking about the establishment of Sharia law in Kashmir. And as somebody, and when I think about that, and when in the United States, we're so much about freedom of religion, right? Practice of everybody, the minorities, the majorities, everybody. So how can we then apply in Kashmir a whole different philosophy that, no, we want to support a freedom movement that is against minorities, and we want to establish just one faith majority, which is quite the opposite of Western thinking. So that always makes me have this juxtaposition with the West when people are about free Kashmir, is that they only look at it from this fashionable woke lens without realizing like what is really being established, right? It's really an establishment, as Rohit said, a theocratic state. And when you think of the viability of Kashmir, it's just geopolitically, it just doesn't make sense for it to ever live alone, and to really truly be independent without external entities funding something, whether it's military, whether it's militants, whether it's the terrorists, because it's just never going to live in what I think of as a peaceful country.
Yeah, I think those are both really, really important perspectives, and I think what you guys have brought out is why your stories are being gaslit, and why you guys have been denied your rightful place kind of on platforms about Kashmir. Because if your story were to be given a spotlight, if people were to know about it, then people would have qualms about the Azadi movement. They would think about, what is the actual character of a Azad Kashmir, or is it going to be protecting its minorities? And in order to kind of preserve this pristine, clean image that Rohit was talking about, that's kind of one of the reasons I think why your stories have been ignored so much, because they kind of get right at the heart of this whole Azadi movement. Cutting to August 5th, 2019, let's focus first on the positive reactions. So you guys, your families are from Kashmir. Many of your family members probably have directly lived there as well, or had lived there as well. What was your family's reactions when they heard that Article 370 was going to be abrogated? What was that like?
Okay, I'll go. So,
I'll say, Nisha, you can go first this time.
Okay.
So I will say my family's reaction was, I think, disbelief. I think mine as well. That did this really happen? And for my family, I would say celebration. I think in a really short way, celebration. I know some of our family friends like genuinely celebrated and had like little miniature parties. And I think a lot of the media took that and ran with it and said, look at these RSS right-wing KPs. They forgot about their neighbors and really twisted what this meant for us. And that was really, really hurtful to see. Rohit, how about you?
We didn't like, I wouldn't say like throw a party or anything like that, but it was for my mom and dad, because we don't know the full implications of 370. We don't entirely know how in the long run this could benefit us, but in the now, it gave my parents a kind of sense of relief, because 370 was an utterly barbaric article. It really was. There were so many things that were coming bad out of it, such as women couldn't buy land, minorities weren't given space, child marriages were legal under 370. I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound good to me. So there were a lot of bad things about it, and our parents kind of were able. It's kind of like you took a 5-pound dumbbell off the right shoulder. They finally were able to have a little lighter room. For now, we feel there's some sort of solace we're getting out of it. And in no way are we harming anyone else doing this. This was benefiting one group and harming 30 others. And by removing this facade of an article, we are not harming anybody. And so we feel some sort of relief right now, and we're gonna have to wait and see what else can come from it.
Absolutely. And so you guys, it's not a celebratory atmosphere maybe at your house, but it's hopeful.
Right.
It's looking forward.
Mm-hmm.
And then you guys step out of your house and you see this completely different reaction. What was that like? I know, Nisha, you talked a little bit about the teach-ins that you went to earlier. Can you talk to us a little bit about who's behind those teach-ins? Like, what are the groups, what are their interests, and also like what is the narrative that's kind of spread at those teach-ins?
So the first teach-in I went to, there's two that I'll highlight. So one was a teach-in that was just, I think, a week after. I think it was on like August 13th or 14th, so about a week after, done by an organization called Stand With Kashmir. And they're one of the largest organizations that I believe exist, you know, post August 5th, that really peddle the Free Kashmir movement to like the nth degree. They hold tons of protests and teach-ins all over the country, and they did it constantly, nonstop. And hats off to them for doing it with the consistency and conviction that they do. The one that I went to in Washington, D.C. Was partnered up with a local group called the Muslims Justice Coalition or something of that nature. And the way that the program was set up was to first talk about the history of Kashmir, basically set the stage as to why you should care, and then talk about social media campaign toolkits that they had already gotten ready, like what type of language you should be putting in letters to Congress, what you should be tweeting, what you should be Instagramming, what are the hashtags. It was a very well-oiled, organized machine with infographics of all sorts already set out. And majority of that audience was predominantly non-Desi, non-brown, at least from just like a physical appeal. It was a lot of other 20-something-year-olds who came through, once again, in this woke culture that we are supporting, you know, an international entity that needs to be free. And that setting up the stage was so key because they started history at 1930, which is very, very strategic because that's when the Dogra rule was there. And then 1947 is when independence happened. Here we are 70, 80 years later. So very, very strategic, very purposeful. But there was, you know, what happened was there was a couple Kashmiri Pandits who were in the room that I didn't know of. But then they started speaking up. And because they were seen to be disruptive, the whole group started chanting to get out. And that broke my heart because it was non-Kashmiri people or non-Indian people or nobody who had stake in the valley, right? Who's telling actual Kashmiri Pandits who have, you know, migrant numbers. One lady who was standing up, she's seen her uncle or a really close relative be slaughtered in Kashmir, and they were being literally kicked out. And for me, it was like, this is literally 1990 happening in like a very different form and almost more disgusting in a very different way. And those folks who were chanting had no idea what they really were actually peddling forward. So that was my first experience. And those have happened multiple times. I've been to very similar arenas questioning, and whenever Kashmiri Pandits question the narrative, they get told to leave. They get told that they're disruptive. They get told that they're right wing, that all we are we're just Hindu. We're not Kashmiri Hindus. We're just this Hindu RSS or BJP supporters. So that's one type. The second type I went to, which was a little bit different, which was hosted by the Middle East Forum, where the Pakistani, what they called POK's president, because that's the part of Kashmir that went to Pakistan, which they call Azad Kashmir. And once again, very similar, we were told that the Indian side is so repressive, that people of Kashmir want to be part of Pakistan. And this is coming from an elected official who has an official title in Pakistan. Which is really funny. If you know anything about Pakistan, they have many, 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 many issues when it comes to minorities and how they treat Kashmiris. And I would say a lot of Kashmiris in India used to be for the Pakistan movement until they got light of what is happening in POK, not Azad Kashmir, because I don't think anything about Azad Kashmir is actually free. You know, I questioned him in a very open forum that why do you call, because he kept calling it Kashmir IOK, which is India Occupied Kashmir. I said, why do you call it Azad Kashmir when it's actually POK? And I also asked him that you revere JKLF, which is a known, really the reason 1990 happened. And he stuttered and just focused on completely derail my question. So it was a very very scary form when I think about it, that I questioned on video camera. But it needs to be heard, and somebody needs to go into these forums and debate what they're saying.
Yeah. Absolutely. And before I come to Rohit, the elected official of POK focused on your name, if I remember correctly.
He's trying to draw a parallel that why are you you were given the name Nisha, and that's what you call yourself, and the people of Pakistan or the people of POK call that they live in Azad Kashmir, so they have the right to call it Azad Kashmir. And then he completely negated my JKLF story, completely negated the idea of Batakarat, completely did not talk about any of that. So very easily, he's very articulate. If you've ever heard him speak, he's very convincing. I will definitely give him that.
And thank you so much for your bravery. I think one of the things that we need to recognize also is that Kashmiri Pandits throughout the US and throughout the world have often stood up to this type of bigotry. And kind of the same thing happened in Princeton as well, where I go to school, which is that there were a lot of Kashmiri Hindus that came to a panel that was very similar to this Stand with Kashmir teaching that you're talking about. And they were also basically told to leave, and the audience clapped after they left. So it is very similar, very common reaction that people have. And it's very unfortunate. So Rohit, can you talk a little bit about your experience as well? Like what did you see, hear, and personally interact with after the abrogation happened?
So my experiences are definitely a lot different from Nisha, because there weren't many stand-ins or anything actually in Texas. We're pretty, I guess, bright state, so there's not too many of those kind of woke mindset stuff here. But I have a few instances where it didn't play to my favor. I actually went to Howdy Modi in September. And that's, like I said, the start of my, I would say, advocacy side for Kashmiri Pandits. That's when I started becoming more, in line with these things. And outside, for miles and miles, you could see billboards saying that, the government of India is oppressive and that, Kashmir doesn't belong to India. Even when I went to the Howdy Modi event, Hassan Minhaj was actually there, and he put on social media that he was denied access to go and a whole bunch of things, even though you had to register, and there's a whole bunch of complicit things he had to do, and he didn't follow that. And it's kind of shameful to see that in an environment that was providing solace for 50,000 plus people in a dome like that, there were probably 3 times as many protesters outside, fed wrong things. And seeing that is kind of hurtful, because we're not people to justify genocide, and that's something that isn't in our minds. So it's kind of oppressive to see that in my mindset. And then after that event, the amount of backlash I got in gaslighting, it wasn't in person. It was actually it was on virtual for the most part, such as these panels and everything. I actually had another event where I don't know how this happened, but I was grouped with a few students, and they all happened to be Palestinian. I was only Hindu, let alone Indian, on that table. And when they asked me where I was from, I said India. And they asked me what part of India, because you don't look Indian. And I was like, yeah, I'm from Kashmir. And the looks on their faces were kind of taken aback, because it was, I guess, their first time seeing a Kashmiri say India as their home. So they asked me why I support a far-right president, and a prime minister, my bad, and how do I support a fascist regime? And I was like, I honestly can't answer that question because you're wrong. And they asked me why what do I feel pride in, and how do I feel about the current genocide going on in India? And when I presented them with facts saying that there was not a genocide in India, considering that Kashmir is still 99% Muslim, and that demographic hasn't changed. Even the current deaths toll is not citizen high, it's army and terrorist high. There's been a 40% drop in actual terrorist organizations in Kashmir. And we presented facts. These guys are honestly using the emotional narrative to combat me. And so Nisha and I have noticed that in order to kind of push our narrative forward, we actually have to see past this victim narrative that they're presenting. And that is something I have been seeing on social media alone. Just the other day, I was told that I'm not Kashmiri, and that there's no such thing as a Kashmiri Hindu, and that Hindus are not indigenous, but all Kashmiris are indigenous. So it's something that like, it's not just us presenting our narrative, it's kind of, we have to combat in kind of a false emotional kind of presentation too.
Right, absolutely. And you've in particular have been gaslit on social media a lot over the past 2 months, I would say, while we've been on lockdown. So do you want to talk a little bit about your experiences? Because I think they're particularly indicative of the ways in which Kashmiri Hindus are shut down when they try to speak up, and also indicative of the misconceptions somebody who doesn't know a lot about Kashmir would come in with. So could you just share a few of the tidbits? There's many, but could you just share a few of them?
Sure. So I would say there's kind of two branches to this, because youth in its own, like Nisha was saying, the woke mindset is very prevalent among American youth here. But with that, there's a device, there's kind of a division between the youth itself. We have youth that support us, and that's not too many. And then we have youth against us. And within the youth against us, it's people who are basically misinformed. And once you kind of tell them these things, they kind of realize that they were wrong or they were fed in wrong information. And then you have our own Kashmiri youth, which is divided. People who don't recognize our plight at all, and in fact don't want to share about our plight at all. They refuse to believe anything happened. And it's upsetting to see that not only are other people against us, but it's our own brother and sisters kind of mindset. And I have a few examples of this. So Twitter is a very, very, I wouldn't say beautiful, but it's a very big social media platform. And that's actually where I get a lot of my social platform going forward. And that's also the place where I get the most interactions with. When I made a thread actually about Ajay Pandita's death, which was about 2 months ago, I believe, I not only talked about his death, but I also talked about the persecution that Hindus have faced in Kashmir for the past 700 years. And while I got support from quite a bit of people, such as the South Asian Heritage Forum, I managed to meet great people like you, Parth, and like a whole bunch of other things. I was being told by Kashmiri Muslims that I don't know my past and that I don't know the history. We have people telling me, there was someone with the last name Pandit, a Muslim, telling me that I didn't know my past, even though his last name literally means Hindu. So it's kind of like you have to work for not just helping counter one narrative, but helping counter all narratives. Because as you both know, our own issue it's being used as a political ploy on other sides. And that once you talk about Hindus, you actually break the other narratives. So it's kind of working through that.
Yeah. And what about you, Nisha? Have you also experienced that same type of gaslighting on social media that Rohit mentioned?
So I learned earlier on to put less in writing. So I only have a couple things that are actually on social media, but I got less gaslit. Yeah, I wouldn't say I experienced the same, but once again, I don't have the same social media presence as Rohit does. I think I get more so gaslit in person because that's the medium that I have chosen to advocate through. And so similar, just a different face of the same thing. Just not it's not written medium, that's it.
And Rohit, you had also mentioned that you created a series of posts about what your family had specifically gone through, different family members, like a Humans of Kashmir type of series. And you made this with Prasiddha, with the help of Prasiddha. So what was the reaction to it? Because I heard also that this was something where on an Instagram handle that you were told that this never happened, even though it was personal stories from family members.
Right. So thankful to Prasiddha and the South Asian forums. They actually interviewed my parents and I about a month ago, I would say. And it was to the tune of Humans of New York. So we did Humans of Kashmir. And I thought it was really well put because it's a really good, captivating way to bring people in to realize that there's two sides to the story. And On Instagram, we did not receive too much backlash, I would say. It was actually a lot of support, and the people who did say stuff, they were quickly dismantled, and they realized that they're wrong in their thing. But on Twitter is where, like I said, Twitter is where I get a lot of backlash from, and that's actually where I saw, for the first time in my life, someone denying Hindu genocide. I've always heard that, you know, there's such thing as when Jewish people are told that the Holocaust doesn't exist. There's these type of things, and I've heard that this could happen, and never have I once experienced it. But for the first time, I was being told that my Twitter posts and my South Asian forum kind of humans to the Kashmir was a lie, and that my entire post was a lie, and that I am a Indian stooge. Although I have no citizen, I'm not a citizen of India, nor can I vote for India. I cannot do anything for India. And it was the first time where I was being told that I'm lying, that I have no clue as to what happened. And when I presented this said individual about my sources of evidence, and I had people even back me up on this, and there was not much opposition besides that, I was being told that I'm immature, and that the sources I have provided are not true, and that they're all Hindu sources, even though they weren't. So it was interesting to see for the first time denial. And that book that was presented, Parth, you actually told me that I read about it recently, and it was just conspiracy theories. It was not an actual source. It was just some dude talking about, did it happen, even though there was no backup to it. So it's a big mix, kind of.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think it's unfortunate that a lot of these gaslighting tactics and myths about Kashmiri Hindus are often spouted in these kinds of more academic pieces. The people who were at that that teach-in were themselves academics. So I think sometimes when voices like that start saying these things that are, if they happen to any other community, it would be labeled genocide denial, because that's what it is. When people start saying that, that's when people get confused and they think that that's the actual truth. But I want to focus on another aspect, which is the positive side of this, which is, have you guys been able to get any people who aren't, let's say, Hindu, to listen to your stories, to identify with them, to post them on social media, and try to learn more about the Kashmiri Hindu community through whatever's happened over the last year?
Yeah, I mean, I think personally, like my friends who are non-Kashmiri and also non-Desi, they support me, and they've been supporting me for a really long time. I have colleagues I have this conversation with a lot. Also very unassuming case I have these conversations on is on dates as well, because it's a great way to see where somebody is, but also educate somebody in a very civil manner. So whenever I do get a chance to talk about politics to anybody, I do try to bring it up and just to throw in some information, and it's been helpful. I think people are willing to listen. Whether they actually believe you, I think, is secondary, but just being able to get some seed of not doubt, but another form of information in someone's head. And even if they go and Google, well, Kashmiri Hindu, what is that? That is a huge win for us, right? We're such a small community that even getting someone to just do a little bit of a deeper dive has been helpful. I think in the past year, we've had vigils in Washington, D.C., in very like prominent public areas, like the Lincoln Memorial, Washington, D.C. We had in front of the White House, we had a commemoration of January 19th. So those events, they're very peaceful in nature, right? We're doing vigils where people are not angry. There's no reason to, be combative, but simply just sharing like a flyer or a piece of paper or one page that we put together as to why we were standing there, for what purpose, I think has opened a dialogue with at least a couple hundreds of people. And forums like this online definitely help people, even if they tune in. I know this was a 2-day event, but even if someone tunes in for 5 to 10 minutes, just to know of our presence and our viewpoint is sufficient when we're going from literally zero to something. So I do think it's been helpful. I think Rohit had some pretty good luck when it came to our campaign, the social campaign about Ajay Pandita, with getting your friends to post as well.
Right. So to add on to Nisha, yeah, we actually had I kind of like two ways with this. So we actually did have a January 19th vigil, just like Nisha was saying, and we even got a congressman at the 22nd district to recognize that January 19th was Exodus Day for us, and he actually wrote it down and he put it in some decree of some sort. I'm gonna have to check out the logistics for that. But he went there, and we actually had a big panel. My mom sang. We had a few people sing, and it was a nice candlelight vigil. And it wasn't just Kashmiris. It was actually dominantly non-Kashmiris there, Hindus for the most part, but kind of recognizing that, this is an issue and it must be brought out. So it was going from, like Nisha said, going from 0 to, 0 plus 1 is always a great step. And that was just the one part. The other part is through social media, actually, to get a bit lucky with this. When I made that thread about Ajay Pandita, it actually reached a few sources such as South Asian Nation, the South Asian Heritage Forums, Riddhi.rebutes on Instagram. These people actually liked it up and they kind of shared it out. And yeah, that's where I got a lot of my backlash from, because they were more prominent voices. But seeing my voice being heard for the first time, and seeing my mom and dad kind of realize that we didn't screw up with the kid. We finally taught our kid Kashmiri stuff, he's advocating. And it was really good to see that for the first time, that our voice isn't fully lost. It's still there. Yeah. And even my own roommate, my best friend, he did not know much about it. He knew that I was from Kashmir, and he knew I was a Hindu, but he knew about the lockdown that occurred in the first few months. And he was also a bit upset about it. But once I showed him the HSC panel we did, and he kind of, realized that there's more to the story. And I have quite a bit of friends that opened their eyes on Instagram itself. I had about 15, 20 friends reach out to me, and they're asking me, what thread did you make? I don't get it. And it was a variety of people. It wasn't just Hindus. It was actually dominantly Muslims and Christians asking me what happened. Because, you have literally Stand With Kashmir talking about this and this and this and ignoring us completely. So it was good to see a new change for this. And so 0 plus 1 is always better than 0. So it was good to see that.
That's really nice to hear. And I kind of asked this question also because I think a couple of days ago, one of my friends, she posted on Facebook about the Ram Janmabhoomi issue and what the real narrative was and why Hindu people were celebrating it. And she asked for allies to come there and sort of learn more about the Hindu experience and kind of be advocates for us also. So I think this is really great that you guys are also reaching out to other groups. What are the ways in which the Hindu community can help you in this effort? And what are other things that you guys would like to do to help reach more and more people outside of even the Hindu community who kind of might be sympathetic or are at least open to listening to your experiences?
So I think for Kashmiri Pandits, as something that Rohit said earlier, is that we're pretty divided. Even though we're a very small, and what I like to call, and I tell everybody, that we're pretty endangered, on the verge of extinction. So the fact that even within such a small group of us, we're so divided, it's really unfortunate. So I think what Kashmiri Pandits need to do is we need to, one, unify, and not just unify within Kashmiri Pandits, we need to unify with the whole faith, other Hindus, and we need to stop regionalizing our plight, because what's happening and what happened to us is starting to happen to other areas of India and other Hindus in general, right? Hindus that are also in other parts of South Asia, like in Pakistan and in Bangladesh. And so it's not a Pakistani Hindu issue. It's not a Bangladeshi Hindu issue. I think we keep doing that. And I'm also fault to that as well. Oh, well, I'm not Bangladeshi, so how can I speak about it? But ultimately, there's that phrase that I don't tend to like, that oppression is all the same, or we all have similar stories. And so there's some root that's the same. And the root is that we're all Hindu. We all have had persecutions for thousands of years, hundreds of years. And so we need to unify behind that. And I think the Ayodhya verdict caused a lot of divide, and caused Hindus to actually have to fight for what I think talking about, I know this is not related to Kashmir, but just because it happened on August 5th of this year, there were Hindus asking Hindus like, well, why can't you just let it go? And what proof do you have that Ram was from there? And there's not many and this is Hindus with Hindus having this. We have to clean up our own home before we start wanting others to believe in our plight. And I do believe there is a lot of folks, my generation, me and Rohit's generation, that are seeing the vilification of Hindus worldwide, and it is invigorating them for sure. That did not exist before, which is really refreshing to see. And because of what has happened in the past year, a lot of other Hindus know about Kashmiri Hindus because you'll see them in comments. Well, why haven't you taught about Kashmiri Hindus? And they're not Kashmiri, I know. So it's really nice to see that somebody else is talking about our plight besides us. So that is a huge positive. But for me, I think moving forward, Kashmiri Pandits, to all the Kashmiri Pandits who are listening to this phone call or will in the future, please unite. We do not need to be fragmented. And second of all, is we need to stop thinking of this as just our issue, and we need to see this as a Hindu issue, and not just India Hindu, all Hindus, whether you live in South Asia or whether you live in the Caribbean. We're all Hindu ultimately. We all have very similar history. And what happened to one Hindu can absolutely happen to us. It's history keeps repeating ourselves. And we need to become more aware of what has happened and stop saying it's so long ago that it happened.
Right, and to add on to Nisha, she just mentioned, we can't forget the past. You actually cannot forget the past. If you forget the past, you're going to repeat it in the future. And it's the past that currently builds up to the present. And ignoring these things is not going to help anyone's cause. Hindus have been one of the most persecuted faiths for hundreds of years. What happened in Kashmir is not just what happened to one instance of Hindus. Hindus have been attacked for a very long time. Mughal rule was complete destruction for Hinduism alone. Afghan rule, all these other rules that were there, it wasn't just set in stone. It was not black and white. And you have to realize that there's more to this. And one divide is obviously within the Hindu community. We have people that don't recognize what's going on to just Hindus in general, and not even just Hindus, Kashmiris. So that's one thing. And also Kashmiris, yes, as Nisha said, if you're listening to this call, if you ever are going to open up a book about something related to us, we need to be united. We have youth that don't like ourselves. We have youth that have no idea what, Kashmir is, what food is, basically. We have adults that when youth step up, adults don't let us speak. It's a big mix, and there's a big divide, not just outside the sphere, but inside the sphere. And a house divided cannot stand. So if we want to make our voice heard, yes, it's great to spread the information, finally teach things. So it's great whenever people who aren't Hindu or aren't Kashmiri talk about the 7 exoduses or the Rama or the temple and a plethora of things. It's great to see that. But it's not great to see your own people against you. So there needs to be some sort of unification on the inside and the outside that we have to focus on.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think those are really powerful stories. And just speaking as somebody who's a Hindu and who's not from Kashmir, I was blown away when I learned about the ways in which Kashmiri Hindus, specifically civilization, affected and was influenced by Hindu civilization throughout the rest of India. It blows my mind because it's not something that non-Kashmiri Hindus even know about. And I think you guys are totally right about the fact that what had happened to your community, both the persecution, the actual physical persecution, those stories also exist within other communities throughout India. Almost every community has some story like that. But also that the gaslighting that you guys are facing right now in 2019, 2020 is also something that young Hindu American youth who talk about their issues, whether it's about Kashmiri Hindus or not, also face. And so I think this is something that we all need to unite on, because it is our issue, right? It shouldn't be seen as it's somebody else's issue. So we're nearing the end of this panel. Would you guys like to say anything to our audience in conclusion about what they can do or what they can do to help and sort of how they should think about the Kashmiri Pandit community? Nisha, maybe you can go first.
So I have a couple things. One, I think we already touched on the unification. I think we all need to share each other's stories to one another. This is more so an ask to Hindu adults who have kids is don't shield your kids from our history. So pass on these stories. I think there is two things that people assume, that when you speak about the truth and you speak about history, you somehow are invigorating hate. And that's not what it is at all. There's a way to teach history without inciting hate. I think they're two separate things. And we need to stop being scared of doing that. Two, which might not sit well with people, is get your kids into humanities, get your kids to be writers, get your kids to be into politics, because ultimately I hear a lot of aunties and uncles so upset that the New York Times writes something bad about Hinduism, or Washington Post. And why do you think that's so? We don't encourage those type of fields in our community. And the only way that we get our voice heard is to be represented in those type of organizations, in politics. Go promote your kid to be part of a political campaign, be the staffer. If you think that those are not powerful roles, they're extremely powerful. And there was a sentence my friend once told me, which is, the folks who have the biggest power or the largest power are those who write history, because they ultimately shape how we perceive that time period. And if we don't have writers that promote our truth, it's going to be forgotten and be written by somebody else that does not understand it. So that is my biggest plea to anybody who's listening and really wants to see the fight of Hindus to continue, and to not let us be forgotten.
To further add on to Nisha, she's absolutely right. We have a lot of people in our community that are upset that, oh, this is happening to our people. And even the American mindset, it's like, oh, this happened, whatever. It's something that we need to be better at. In our own community, just like Nisha was saying, we have aunties and uncles upset about how the media is treating us. And in fact, the aunties and uncles are doing all the work, but they're forgetting that they have kids. Once these people, time comes to an end for everybody, and once these people move on, what are their kids going to do? If you don't teach your kids anything about Hinduism, anything about our past, anything about Kashmir, it's a lost cause. And that's one branch of a tree that's cut off. And it really, you cannot spread your roots if you're not fully, planted in the ground. So we have to pass on the correct mindset, the truth. We have to pass on the truth, whether we like it or not. And I know it's traumatizing for a lot of people to share their experiences, but if my mom can, and she's been through living hell, if my mom and dad can, anybody can. So it's simple as that. It really is simple as that. Sharing the truth, yes, it's bitter. Truth is bitter. We've heard that phrase hundreds of times, but the truth is reality. And it is not a facade that we have to hide behind. It's something we have to keep forward. And that's just within our own community. And for anyone listening to this who's not a Kashmiri, who's not even a Hindu, it's a simple fact that you cannot listen to a statement without having some sort of something to back you up. Don't listen to anything without proof, because someone can tell you something and it won't always be true. You have a lot of organizations such as Central Kashmir that post a lot of things that seem appealing. You have a lot of amazing graphics on Instagram. That's how you get it. People do a look at something. You have like a big, great photo and it has a fancy font, and that's getting a lot of people's attraction. But is it true? So you have to kind of be skeptical a lot of things. And so it's not just teaching our own, but it's teaching everyone else. So be open about it.
I think those are two very, very powerful closing statements. And Anisha, I'm really glad you made this point about students joining the humanities and social sciences, because those are where the narratives are being made. And I really want our community to get out of the doctor, engineer, lawyer mindset that has really crippled our community's ability to tell our own stories. So thank you for making that point.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys, for coming, and it's always a pleasure to speak to you. And it's lovely to be able to call you both friends. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks, Parth.
And thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Yes, our pleasure. And this was a wonderful, wonderful panel. Really looking forward to having the post video done and published it again. We're going to be tweeting these videos and also putting them on Facebook and YouTube and things like that. This narrative has to be said loudly, and we have a lot more things coming up. This is just the beginning of it. We're going to be working on some projects and some initiatives to highlight these narratives, which is extremely important. So I want to thank all of you. Thank you, Parth, for moderating the panel as well. As always, excellent job, excellent panel. And I think this was one of the best conversations that I enjoyed in this entire conference. So kudos to all of you. You guys are representatives of the Kashmiri Pandit community, great voices. And again, once again, thank you very much. So folks, this concludes our conference. Wanted to thank everybody for joining. If you're interested in joining KONA or becoming a volunteer and helping us in different projects, you can visit our website at www.kohna.org, kohna.org. We're working on a lot of different initiatives. Would love to have you all volunteer for us. And you can follow us on our Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter handles at KONA Official. Thank you and namaste all.
Namaste.